Thanks so much, Samir. That was a very interesting paper. Before we take questions from the audience, I'm just wondering, is this going to be part of your forthcoming book?
Yes, I should have mentioned that. That's a chapter in this book that's coming out in March that I mentioned that Vladimir was contributing to. This is my contribution.
And what is the title of that book?
The title of the book is Spectres of Fascism,
right.
Historical, Theoretical, and International Perspectives, and it's going to be out with Pluto.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
Looking forward to reading that.
Thank you.
So I just have a couple of questions. I guess my first question is actually in reference to Hannah Arendt's text on totalitarianism, a novel form of government. And in that text, she starts off by saying we spent too much time concentrating on the totalitarian personality. And we need to look more to the social and political conditions that allow for totalitarianism or fascism to arise. And I'm just wondering, do you have a response to that position?
Yeah, no, good. I don't think that Adorno is just focused on the personality type as such. I mean, what he's doing is, in a sense, developing Erich Fromm's idea of social character. And social character was really a way of thinking beyond, the individual understood along classical sort of, Freudian lines as kind of atomized. But rather, social character was constituted in relation to a given mode of social production and reproduction. So it's not an either or, right? So the social character, the personality type is to be understood really in terms of a constellation of forces in society. And one could turn that around against Arendt in a way in terms of her dissection of the personality of Adolf Eichmann.
Right.
And I think what's interesting is that they arrive at the same or a similar conclusion, that the lack of inability to think is, or the ability only to think in terms of slogans, which ultimately is not thinking, is it? Is what makes Eichmann. So she really does focus on him as a personality type, right?
Yeah.
So this is the personality, the totalitarian personality type. But what's interesting about Arendt in that book is that she wants to show the way in which the individual is both deracinated, right, sort of rendered sort of rootless, and deworlded in a very Heideggerian, a very phenomenological sense, sort of taken out of the fabric of being together with others, experiences a kind of loneliness, isolation, and then a bond with the mass movement. Right, and I think this is really interesting because you have this same kind of dynamic with the internet, don't you? We are always on it. We're interacting with it alone, right, on our own. But we're also then participating in something beyond ourselves, and that which is beyond ourselves, in this sense, authorizes things that we would never do or say or express in a face-to-face kind of context. So there's a way of really drawing out of Hannah Arendt some interesting tools to think about the present. Yeah.
Thanks, Samir. One thing at the very end, I want to come back to how you're talking about the great little man, but at the end, I always think in terms of, when Andrew Breivik or the Christchurch terrorists are brought up as examples of this kind of weaponization of the internet and so on. I mean, I think, according to the Bureau of Investigative Journalism, there's been, the U.S. has killed 8,000 to 12,000 people using drones. Those are effectively using this similar kind of technology. Or I think of Thomas Hirschhorn, whose work Touching Reality about looking at images of the data on their phones, he said was inspired by the photograph of the White House watching the takedown of Osama bin Laden. Which is to say that this kind of scopophilia via the internet, this kind of weaponization of the internet, not to compare numbers or so on, right? But it can only be laid at the feet of these mass murderers. That it's nothing to do with the affordances, as media scholars say, of the internet in general. But I want to come back to your discussion of the great little man. And I think also in some ways, I mean, you started talking about ego identification and ego ideal and so on, and idealized identification. I think that, Zizek's notion of the leader with the pants down, it's actually precisely when Trump or before him, George W. Bush, or even Stephen Harper, when they are mocked, when their failings are shown and so on, that's the moment of identification, because the Trump fan is identifying with them as being attacked. And so I think it's not the same thing. It's not the same logic. I think than the idealized identification kind of moment. Rather, it's a symbolic identification with the person being looked at. That they're looking at me in the same way that Trump is being judged, or George W. Bush, where he's misunderestimating me and
misunderestimating, yeah,
verbal,
yeah,
the Bushisms.
Yeah. Or when he threw up and then fell down in a visit to Japan and so on.
Or Harper's lack of affect and so on.
Yeah.
And I think it's also, I mean, to stay with the personality type for a second, and I wonder what you think about this, because earlier on you were critical of the kind of focus on Trump, and then you seem to fall for it a bit later, and you seem to want to, we all, relish in the stupidities of Trump and so on. And yet, obviously, it has to do with what Nancy Fraser talks about, right populism versus as a corrective to left neoliberalism, i.e., Trump as a corrective to Obama.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Thanks. To answer your second question, maybe I'm rebelling in it a little bit, but I prior to that, I do really set it up in terms of certain kinds of political and economic developments that then make somebody like Trump, and these other figures are very similar. And I think that there's an Indian scholar, Ajay Gudavadi, who's written a book on India after Modi, and he makes this. It's fascinating. He makes the same kind of argument that in India you have some sort of kind of gap appearing between a certain kind of promise and a reality, which then leads the way to the not just Modi, but the whole BJP Hindutva project. And these figures are ultimately dispensable, but they are personifications of a certain kind of affective community that takes a form of religious group or a nation, and so on. So I didn't mean to. So that's what I want to say to that. But I think that the leader with his pants down is precisely, the great little man, the guy who commits these sort of foibles. That's actually part of the attraction, right? And so, it doesn't work just in terms of identification with this figure who embodies both strength and weakness, but when that person is then attacked, that only deepens the affective bond with him, because the people see this then as I think rightly so, an attack on them. The deplorables, the flyover states, the forgotten, and just in New York City at my brother's wedding, and it was wonderful and everything, but there was a kind of sense in the room, and this is a very kind of select group. It's corporate lawyers, Wall Street. There's a sense that the others just don't really exist. They don't matter. So it's a little different from the deplorables. They'll play the kind of game of saying, everybody belongs, inclusivity, right, and so on. The deplorables moment is, I think, a little bit different. I think this is where identity politics hits the rubber of identity politics hits the road of mainstream U.S. politics in an interesting way.
You go ahead and...
Should I?
Yeah.
I think I saw your hand up. Oh, sorry, Sherry, yeah.
No,
but go ahead, yeah. I know your name. Sorry, go ahead.
Briefly, I'm happy to hear you elaborate the Freudian part of this, especially with all the confusion. And you referred briefly to the meaning working through the past, the somewhat later essay.
Yeah.
And then the rest of this was from 1967. And what strikes me is some points that he made in those two later essays that may have been in that one, but weren't emphasized. So you emphasize the guilt of not living up to one's ego ideal. And in the later essays, he emphasizes the fear, the awareness of the other who is not privileged, who really has not gotten the rewards of democracy, and the fear of falling down into that.
Right.
Including with regard to automation.
With regards to?
Automation.
Yes, yes, automation.
Who are going to be
Yeah.
hopelessly unemployed because of automation.
Yeah.
And the agitator types trying to exacerbate and escalate that fear in order to make the people more subject to unconscious force.
Yeah, yeah.
The other thing that I just want to say, because it seems so nice in the Rechtsradikalismus lecture, is that Adorno said, there is no point trying to appeal to the moral sense of these alt-right people.
Yeah.
You have to, and certainly no point in trying to match them with counter-propaganda, because all they have is propaganda.
Yeah.
You have to try to show them that objectively their interests are not being served.
Yeah, very good.
You have to do it by same old dialectical thinking, unfolding the contradictions, what's being heard, and describing very specifically the propaganda tricks that are being used.
Yeah.
That seems like good advice.
No, absolutely. Just quick comments on those. The first point is really well taken, although it's, fear plays such a key role in dialectic enlightenment as well, right? That what we see in enlightenment is a kind of radicalization of mythological fear, right? And this is not really a new idea in a way, because it's there in Weber's account of the origin of capitalism. What drives the Puritan on isn't really a positive thing. It's not so much a desire for accumulation. It becomes that eventually, but really it's not the pull, but it's the push. It's the push of the fear of eternal damnation. So there's that radicalized mythological fear, because now you have a monotheistic God, looking down on you and judging you in this way. So I think this is really an important kind of affect, which comes back in a big way in neoliberalism, right? Where you have the, no longer any protections, or fewer protections under the by the state. So I think that's key. And I think this identification in this lecture of the figure of the obsolete laborer is fascinating. And I mean, come on, 1957, this is the height of the Wirtschaftswunder, right? The miracle. And he's already seeing something that now we discuss so much these days. So it's incredibly prescient. Yeah, thank you for that. Oh, I'm to do this?
I saw Hilda's hand up
Okay, all right.
at the beginning.
Yeah, we have time. Yeah.
With regards to the personality, right? Like this diagnostic of sociological categories. I wanted to ask you. I have read your paper for the spectrum of fascism, and I didn't have the opportunity to ask you. How would you position the difference between the application of this personality to, let's say, people who follow Trump, Bolsonaro, Johnston, from those that follow Evo Morales or AMLO in Mexico or Bernie Sanders, right?
Yeah.
What is the moment in which you could articulate that difference? Because obviously we are all subjects of the unconscious and we are subjected to the mass. And I'm asking you this because I cannot discuss this, for example, in social media, because everything is either you are this side or you are the other side. But I hear my good friends from Chile or from Quito or from Bolivia that they are asking these difficult questions of also the left comes with this mass mentality of kind of eroding the institutions and also committing atrocities. And obviously my heart is on the left and for that kind of emancipation, but at the same time, how could you locate the difference? What could make the difference that doesn't trap? And just, as you know, with the master's kind of paper that I did for that book, so do you want a master, right? That's kind of the problem, no? How would you reconcile with that?
That's a fantastic question. Thank you. It's not an easy one to address. I mean, Muth, in her book on left populism, just came out 2018, is apologetic about the left requiring a leader around which demands could be said to coalesce or crystallize. And if you look at, we can have a meaningful discussion about left populism, as you mentioned. I mean, not only the Bolivarian experience in Central America and South America, but also, as you point out, Sanders and Corbyn. And I was actually talking to Am Johal for a podcast about this, and kind of against myself, I actually said, it's not a bad thing that Elizabeth Warren has now gained a kind of prominence, is also representing, in a sense, a kind of left position. I'm critical of it, but nonetheless, it's opening things up, and she is a kind of example of the kind of intervention that Sanders has made, which somebody on the right typically doesn't do in the same way. So this goes to the fact, I think, that, and it's there in Guterman and Lumenthal, there's an emphasis on the left, I think, still on discourse, on argumentation. And again, this is why I'm very concerned about the kind of enthusiasm for affect today. Reason, that's Eurocentric. What we need is feeling. We need to, and you even hear this in everyday talk, right? It used to be the case, you'd say something like, I think that. Today, people say, I feel that. I feel this. I feel that. Well, I think this is dangerous. And so this would be a key difference, that people like Corbyn will stand up and give reasons for their positions, will give evidence for their positions. They'll take unpopular positions up, say on the Iraq War, and decades later they're proven to actually have had the right position. Whereas what you see on the right is obfuscation, it's talking points, it's an appeal to the feelings and really the sad, the dark affects of their followers. I think this is a key difference. But I think that this possibility has always been there. Of course we know this, right? We know this. There's been a cult of personality around Stalin, a cult of personality around the anti-Stalin, Trotsky, right? This is a problem that has been present on the left since the Russian Revolution. You can take it even back to the skirmishes and arguments between Marx, Engels, and Bakunin, and so forth. So it is something we have to address. We have to learn from that history. But I think minimally you could say there is a program that's being offered to the followers of left populist parties. There's an attempt to empower the people. Often that goes very badly wrong. And I think the Lula experiment is a good example. We could talk more about that, but I think there are other questions. But I think that would be a way of thinking about the difference. Purely affective appeal, cult of personality on the one hand, versus an attempt to present a program and enter into a kind of rational discourse and dialogue on the other,
Very briefly, Samir, thanks very much for that. I think about 4 years ago, there was a conference, the Institute held a conference called The State of Extraction, about 4 years ago.
Yeah, about that, yeah.
Just very briefly, I'm wondering if you see any links between extractivism as a political and economic ideology and practice and the rise of fascism. Are there any cultural, whatever links you see would be interesting?
That's a fantastic question. And in his book, India After Modi, Ajay Godavardi does make an express link between the increasing authoritarian tenor of Indian politics and the extractivist projects that are afoot in the center of the country. Chandigarh, for example. This is what Arundhati Roy has written quite a bit about, and the sort of the Maoist struggle against these extractivist industries. I think that when we talk about extractivism, though, we're really talking about a kind of recolonization. And colonization, imperialism has historically been linked to fascism. And so that connection, in a sense, returns. You see this, I think, in Bolsonaro in the most clearest sense of really trying to ethnically cleanse indigenous people, keep them, move them off the land and open it up for development. And what you need then is a kind of, white supremacist ideology to justify that. And I think this is exactly what's going on there. And it's, returned, of course, in Bolivia, the attempt to get indigenous peoples out of the cities, onto the land. This is a dimension. And of course, what's going on there is an extractivism geared to, is it lithium, I think, yeah. So, yeah, thank you for that. It's a really good question. Yeah. Oh, parched.
Thanks very much for the talk. I just had, well, not exactly a question, maybe more of just a observation or a comment based on some things you said. Something you mentioned was, we feel our bond because we hate the others, right? This sort of thinking, embodied like, infidels is a word, another word is urban Naxals or anti-nationals, right? That kind of becomes this like thing that the cult circulates. And then this other thing you mentioned was fascism forgoes like the differences within the group to focus on the differences without. And this is something I feel that like liberal, that is to say, a historical sort of understanding of what is going on in India is unfortunately perpetuating as well, because you see like op-eds in the New York Times and Washington Post where all these like liberals are talking about the Hindu-Muslim divide that the RSS is focusing on, but they're doing it in like a really non-nuanced way. It's like, I really want it to be talked about, but better. Like, what I mean is that like, it's not just that like, oh, it's just all Hindus together hating on the Muslims. The logic of the hatred for the Muslims and the sort of processes through which Muslims are being converted into second-class citizenship today is an outcome of the RSS's casteist ideology. And it's actually because of how they would deal with Dalits and taking inspiration from Brahmanism over centuries and how it has dealt with Dalits. So I feel like it's in not considering that sort of, because like Dalits are also being lynched. But the conversation is only about Muslims being lynched. Not to say that like we shouldn't be talking about it. Of course we should be, right? It's just that like I just feel like when people miss the actual project and end up sort of what am I looking for? Just rooting their critique in just like a false understanding of history, just ends up providing us with no answers at all in terms of how do we actually combat that? Because to them the only answer seems to be to voting back the Congress to power. Which did not do anything about casteism in its own time, Yeah. And just, I guess, a way to relate that to a question would just be bringing it back to in the morning when you mentioned memes and the way they're perpetuated. Because, WhatsApp is a massive thing. I'm subject to a lot of fascist propaganda pouring into my family groups, seeing that in my family circulating. So maybe just if you could just talk a bit more about that, I guess, is what I wanted to say.
Yeah, okay, great. I think what you're saying is that the violence that is the caste system is, in a sense, being displaced onto others, the Muslim community, but also Christians have been attacked. 84 it was Sikh community, it was a terrible massacre. So there's a kind of, weightiness of violence in the society that's, in a sense, ready to be pushed in different directions, and it's right now really being pushed in the direction of anti-Muslim and anti-Dalit forms. And I think this is also then how the unity of an inherently disintegrated society is being constructed, meaning the Hindu community, the Hindu society is being constituted really by this kind of displacement of violence. And I think what you say is just is really on the money. Again, I think this is why there's a certain urgency for a defense of universalism in an Indian context. I would really like us to think beyond the West, but we're always so confined by its own structures. We think that, matters of free speech and discourse, expression, universalism, human rights, civic rights, these things are, they're only articulable in terms that make sense here. There's no world out there at all. There's no possibility that these things might signify very differently in places like India and Bangladesh, South America, in Africa, right? And we need to get over that. We need to be really true to the letter of anti-Eurocentric, which means beyond the West, not just Europe. Really, honestly, that is so important. Otherwise, we just run around, trying to catch our own tails, and it's not good. So, Amit Shah, we don't need a notion of human rights. That's a Western idea. Well, I think there would, according to the logic of certain forms of thought here in the West. So yeah, that's just cultural imperialism. Let's do away with it. Let's join hands with Amit Shah, who's, is president of the BJP.
Yeah, and the Home Minister.
Home Minister.
He also recently said that Muslims are termites, migrants are termites.
Yeah, that's right.
Things like that. And just one more thing I really quickly wanted to add to that earlier point is another thing I think that people miss out when people in the West are looking at all these op-eds being published in well-regulated sources from these liberal people is that those writers are more often than not coming from upper caste as well. So in a way, I feel unconsciously they're sort of defending their caste privilege, because while they can get away with it, they're still consolidating their power and they're holding on to their own privilege, because right now they don't have to
Very good point.
caste, because there's still an external enemy left.
Yeah, very good point. About WhatsApp, I mean, just a quick point. When I was in Brazil, the students there told me that the social media platform of choice of Bolsonaro was WhatsApp, and it would just, text would just circulate, and it would often be from family members, and people would just get swept up in this, and it's quite fascinating. Imagine the same things in India. Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you, Samir, thank you, Samir, for giving us some things to think about, and what I'd like to contribute is from my own psychoanalytic perspective. It has to do with what Willow was wondering about, what makes up a totalitarian personality. And something you said sort of tweaked my mind, and I think this is where if I would put my money, I would put my money. And it has to do with the abject self. Kristeva's written about that in an existential term. And projection of the abject self onto the foreigners, the others around, demonizing them, etc. But then that leaves one's self depleted, kind of empty, kind of void. So it makes it possible for ideologues to sell us with their product. And especially people like Trump, who seems very much like an abject individual, so they can identify with him. So then what do we do about the abject self? It's a very big problem, because it has to do with narcissistic injury, at the deflated sense of grandiose self. One way of looking at it, essentially, is that it's a lifelong project. It has to do with development. And where there is a big societal problem, I would suggest, is what Piketty wrote about, the divergence between the very rich and the very poor. And it is continuing to grow. And I would suggest that a way around this to push up the lower rungs of the poor and the abject is free education. It was almost free when I was in university. You know, how much is it now? It's out of sight, and so the abject population is growing because they've starting out they already have a blow to their self-esteem.
Yeah, no, I think this is absolutely right, and Piketty advocates punitive wealth taxes. Right. So
pay for the education.
well, not just education, but to address the fundamental inequality in society. I think it's absolutely right. But I think that what might be important to recognize here, and I think that the question of totalitarianism is a delicate one now, because the European Union has recently, I think, articulated a declaration condemning both fascism and communism. And your background is Hungarian, and I understand that. But I think we need to be very careful and not allow this false equivalence to carry the day. And it really is a false equivalence insofar as what the Nazis undertook was precisely what Hitler wrote about in Mein Kampf. Communism, on the other hand, actually a formally existing communism, was not at all what was, in a sense, theorized. There was a complete betrayal. I mean, Stalin was a complete opposite of, this vision of the flourishing of individuality in a society in which the contradiction between the individual and community was reconciled.
There, and I know something because I'm Hungarian, communism became the new aristocracy. Communists were the nobles.
The nomenclatura. Yeah, no, absolutely.
Suppressed the kulaks.
It was a total betrayal of a radical egalitarian vision. So this is why we cannot allow there to be an equivalence. It's a false equivalence between fascism and communism. One was a realization of a theory, the other was a betrayal. At the same time, I think it's absolutely right. We need to look at and learn from that historical experience and learn from people like Hannah Arendt and others.
Hopefully just a simple question, but hearkening back to the earlier point about the tension between Adorno's sort of Freudian side and his materialist side, I'm curious whether you would argue that his lifelong project was for the supremacy of the sort of cultural individual explanation for authoritarianism, or whether he was designing his arguments to operate in tandem with other members of his crew, thinking of maybe Bloch's work on the ontology of authoritarianism, or Marcuse's work even. Mm-hmm. If he was consciously going to collaborate in a sense by putting out one angle because these other guys were covering something else, or whether he was making the argument that his idea was the prime reason for authoritarianism.
Did you say the cultural individual?
Yeah, this idea of sort of the great little man and taking the cultural angle of the way that we would identify as a group with this leader rather than taking a more sort of material or a farther out philosophical side.
Okay, yeah. So
does that make sense?
Maybe I didn't. Yeah, it does. Maybe I didn't make my argument clear enough because I was trying to argue that in fact Adorno's contribution is a materialist understanding of the conditions for the possibility of both the rise of a figure like this and also the attractiveness. So this is a solution to a problem that's generated by socioeconomic crisis. It's inherent in liberal democratic society. And the way I pitched that, and I should have really emphasized the fact that to not say it in these terms, to just say it's a problem of Trump, well, then it's just a matter of getting, the strongest Democratic candidate to go up against him. Well, is it Buttigieg? It's not so much Biden, not Harris. As opposed to saying, look, Trump and figures like him respond to a particular socioeconomic crisis. Who amongst us can actually address that in ways that would win the day? Well, it would be somebody like Bernie Sanders. One would hope. So It is absolutely grounded in materialist analysis, but I think amongst these figures there are different emphases. An essay that I would highly recommend to you and others who are interested in this question, particularly the one of fear, right? Fear and politics, anxiety and politics, is Franz Neumann, who's very close to Marcuse in particular, as a political economist, but used Freudian categories in a fascinating way to look at the conditions, again, for the possibility of this kind of authoritarianism, the weaponization of fear. So, thanks.
It's 5:30. Should we wrap up now? Or should
One
we
more
just-
question
okay,
from
okay.
Sherry, because she's only stealing from her own time, so it's okay.
That's
I
fine.
just-
Yeah, I wanted to, speaking of fear and crisis and universality, I wanted to ask for your reflections on the issue of climate change, which on the one hand is inspiring fear probably in everybody, and at least on the surface so far is resulting in more authoritarianism, more anti the other,
Yeah.
probably more direct violence as we get farther along.
Yeah.
On the other hand, to be addressed requires a universality of we are human beings and this is where we live and we better do something that
Yeah.
will help for all of us.
Yeah.
So that has that ambiguity, that double potential. So, your comments.
Oh, well, that's an interesting question. Yeah, so one of the key components of all the authoritarians that we've sort of gone through today, and it certainly held for authoritarianism in the 20th century, was anti-intellectualism. And now today we see especially not just targeting journalists as the enemies of the people, but also climate scientists in particular, because they don't come to the conclusions that these authoritarians are often engaged in extractivism, oil and gas, and so on, coal, and want to hear. So there's this clamping down. It's a bit embarrassing for the postmodern left, mind you, which is always trying to, in a sense, deconstruct the value of science, trying to undermine the universality of truth claims, and so on. This is not, it's not just a kind of philosophical question, but it has a real resonance within the public sphere, and it's unfortunate how so much of kind of leftist discourse is anticipated the far right today. And it's uncomfortable, it's embarrassing, it's unfortunate, but there it is, So yeah, we have to raise the question of a certain kind of universalism of the impact of climate change, but then again, it's not really, is it? I mean, part of the problem is the West and the elites within the West don't see this as hitting them as hard as it is now hitting people in the global South, right? And until it really starts hitting them hard, they're not going to do anything, and then it's too late. People say that already we're in a very bad situation. So it's a kind of universalism, but it's not. This is the whole discussion of the Anthropocene, right? It's humanity's impact, right, on natural environment, on the planet. But it's not humanities. It's a particular slice of humanities within a particular social structure. And I think until we talk about that social structure and transforming it, we're going nowhere. Because this is ultimately, Adorno talks about the nihilism of the far right. If it can all just go under. It can all just be, the world can be destroyed. But that's a kind of voluntarism of nihilism. We don't need that because it's built into our social system, right? An idea of accumulation without end, accumulation for its own sake. A kind of machinery of accumulation is a machinery of death, isn't it? I'm not being hyperbolic. This is where it should go. So climate change has to really, it's like that kind of slogan, which I don't really like, but it's system change, not climate change. This is where the energies have to go. And maybe, getting back to your point about showing people an objective interest in transforming capitalism, climate is a bit of a, it's this sort of strange object, right, that we can't really quite grasp, but we can grasp the way in which capitalism impinges upon our lives in so many different ways, and we have an objective interest in at least ameliorating aspects of it and maybe transforming it. So, thanks.
Is it okay if I comment just briefly on your response? Just one small thing, which is, I think one of the problems is that the universalism that we have does not include the global south. And I think we need to look to a universalism that includes the earth. And so we need to look to ecofeminism and the ecosexuals and to all of these other different people who are talking about a broader notion of universalism. So
Adorno talks about including, non-human animals and sensuous nature.
And
the primacy of the
post-human
object.
feminists talk about that too. Post-human feminists.
Yeah.
I mean, there are a lot of people talking about it too.
But you can't say the global south isn't included. I don't think that's not true. There are forms of universalism that are extant and that are in the process of being extinguished in the global south.
Okay.
So anyway,
Okay.
thanks.
Thank you, Samir.
Thank you.
Thank you.